Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
And so Zhou Enlai just his face just lights up, and he comes over and he shakes my hand, a double, triple shake again. Anyway, it was a real moment for me.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Bill Hodes was an American schoolchild in 1950s revolutionary China. This is the second part of his story. He had the unique opportunity to meet one of China's most revered leaders, Zhou Enlai, the first premier of the People's Republic of China, and how he played softball with US and British prisoners from the Korean War who had refused to return home. The narrative takes a poignant turn as he recounts his involvement in the Mississippi Freedom Summer, a significant civil rights initiative aimed at combating racial injustice. I'm delighted to welcome Bill Hodes back to our Cold War conversation. Now, you were quite good at swimming and you met a VIP at one of your swimming competitions.
Right, that was a great story. Since I had grown up on Cape Cod in the summers, as I had mentioned before, I was a pretty good swimmer. I wasn't a competitive swimmer or anything, but I was very, very good for a kid, and not all that good. But when we not long after we got to China, I got involved in training on the Beijing swim team. And I was nowhere near one of the best, but I was good enough so that I could swim, and we trained, and at least one semester, maybe it was the whole school year, we all the people who were on the team would go to our whatever school we were at, and then we would come back to the swimming complex and train in the afternoons, and we lived there. We had our meals there together. It was sort of like an Olympic, the way Olympic athletes typically train these days, all together in one community. And so we would race, and we would compete against, Beijing against Tianjin, or Beijing against Shanghai, or whatever it was. But then one fine day, there was a dual meet between the Beijing swim team and a visiting, I guess it was UK, or same age group as us. Maybe from high school down to junior high, teens, late teens, early teens. And so we were there, we had our meet, and we raced, and we had relays, and we did this. And then after it was over, and I guess we knew in advance, there was going to be a meet and greet with Zhou Enlai, who probably most people on the listening to the podcast know. Zhou Enlai was in many ways sort of a more significant character than Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. He was very erudite. He was absolutely beloved by the Chinese people. He was the foreign minister. He spoke perfect French. He was brilliant, but he was basically like he was our Secretary of State in effect. So he would greet foreign dignitaries, including Russians, obviously, and so he came by, and he's going down a meet and greet line, shaking hands, and first all the young Brit kids are all lined up there, and he's shaking hands, and I'm sure Zhou Enlai spoke fair amount of English, and he was just chatting with them, and he comes along, and then he comes down to the other end of the line, and it's all the Chinese kids. So he starts shaking their hands, and then suddenly he gets to me, and he does an absolute, as if it was in a Hollywood movie, double take. He said, "Whoa, what's this?" Because he could see that I'm wearing the bathing suit, the colors of not the British team, but the Beijing team. And he said, "Whoa," and he sort of, narrows his eyes, and then one of his aides, comes up and sort of whispers in his ear something like that. "Oh yeah, that's the kid of one of the American, scientist who came over and was fired." And so Zhou Enlai just his face just lights up, and he comes over and he shakes my hand, a double, triple shake again. Anyway, it was a real moment for me. obviously.
Wow. What did your parents think of the fact that you'd met him?
Oh yeah, that was bee's knees. It was wonderful. I'm not. I don't know how much or how little contact they had with with Chinese leadership. They had, they had obviously all sorts of connections with sort of the second to third level people who were making sure everything was going okay, and our needs were being met. And I'm sure they had, they went to meetings and heard a report or something, but something like that, sort of, it's the kind of thing that, just like in the U.S., how many people, you know, actually, get to shake hands with the president or the senator, whatever. So yeah, it was a pretty big deal. It's a big fan. Has always been a big family story for sure.
You were out of school for a day, and there were some special lessons for your classmates.
That was, again, also politically significant in the context of Cold War. There were obviously tensions big time between the US and China. Taiwan was always in the background, but I think it was during the time where Quemoy and Matsu, there was a lot of saber rattling and so on. And so there was some tension. And kids being kids, when we were on the playground playing around, this is when I probably, I've already, my Chinese was pretty good, but probably not perfect. Every once in a while, you have a little squabble on the playground or something, and every once in a while, one or two of the kids would say, "Well, yeah, you think you made the basket or whatever it was. You're just made. You're just an American imperialist." May is short for May. Well, I'm American May. D imperialist, and it was somewhat in jest. But anyway, what I later learned was, at some point during that first year and a half, when I was out sick, I had a cold or something around something. The authorities or the school shut down the school and required everyone, in all the students, to participate in a day long, you call it a mass meeting or a seminar or whatever. I forget what we would call it today, but basically, they taught the kids, no, Bill Hodes, Robert Hodes, all those people, these are not the American imperialists. These are the people who are fighting the imperialists with us. They came over here. He was exiled from his country. They're here helping us. They're our friends. Um, and again, this is typical both of the line that they wanted to take, but also typical of the way Chinese do things. Just like, if you want to kill a million sparrows, you do it right. You do it. And this not voluntary. This was the lesson of the day. No, American communists are on our side, not on their side. And it was, again, an important lesson of this very time that your podcast is all about.
Yeah.
My dad.
Did you meet any of the prisoners of war from the Korean War that refused to go back home?
Yeah, there were. We met a few of them, and they were some of the other Yanks that were in Beijing at the time. I think in total, at the end of the Korean War, there were 17 prisoners of war, most of them American. I know there was one Scots guy that we knew pretty well. I think there were a couple of other Brits, but mostly they were Americans. So by the time we knew them, some of them had married Chinese women that had moved to moved to the countryside or moved to other or to other cities. But yeah, we knew maybe four or five of them quite well, and they were older than I was, but younger than my parents. That kind of age. They were young men coming up, and some of them worked in factories. Some, I think, worked in education. I'm not sure. And yeah, there's a little story behind that. That just out of nowhere, I got the idea that we would gather up some of the Americans, including some of the GIs, me, and there were actually quite a few Americans who had been there with the revolution doing various things that were still there. And I said, let's get a softball game going against the Chinese students at the Foreign Languages Institute who were learning English, and so we did that was kind of a neat thing to be at. Possible we even did it on the 4th of July. I'm not sure, but anyway, we had a softball game out at the Foreign Languages Institute campus, which was just outside of Beijing, run by the way of two Brits, not Americans, Isabel and David Crook. They had been there for much longer than we had, and they had been running this Foreign Languages Institute. I mean, they mainly taught English, but I think they taught French and probably not Russian. Probably the Russians had their own, but they did that, and they were there forever. And that's a whole different story. I don't know their story as much, but they stayed on. And when it got to the Cultural Revolution, even though they were friends of China, had been there forever, like almost everybody, they ended up in prison, and then they couldn't see their kids. And but in those days, they were out there, watching all the Americans play softball.
You returned to the US in, I think it's 1959, really
Right.
after being a member of the Communist Party has been decriminalized. Does it take you quite a while to get used to US life after being in China for 5 years?
Huh. I would say not as much for me because I was older when we left and older when we got back. There were, just sort of everyday customs that seemed unusual to me. I remember one funny little story is our way. Oh yeah, that is interesting. Our way to get back into the U.S. was smoothed in part by my uncle Horace, the pediatrician at Mount Sinai, but just the arrangements and the passports. My grandfather Walter Sachs did help out on that. We got our passport straightened out through our lawyer, but somebody came and probably from Goldman Sachs, I guess, and met us at the airport, and they took us to, I forget where, we had some temporary apartment for a while. And I remember, although it never happened in China, I assumed that as soon as we got out of the car, we would have to tip the driver because it was just somebody. Something was probably some young associate at Goldman Sachs, because I figured, well, in the U.S. everybody tips. It's all sort of a cash transaction. But no, not a huge. And it's possible that one of the reasons that I acclimatized quickly, although certainly I was always amongst my peers, I was sort of an exhibit myself because I was this kid who had come back from China and so on. But I was, in terms of the political reentry and so on, that in part was smoothed over because I attended. We came back to New York. My dad was working at Mount Sinai in New York, so we were living in the Upper West Side of New York, and I went to a very small, very well known progressive high school in Greenwich Village called Elizabeth Irwin High School. It's the little red schoolhouse was its lower grades, and then you would graduate into Elizabeth Irwin, which was named after a education reformer back from the somewhat earlier time. And it was a tiny, tiny. I think there was something like 26, 28, 30 people in each graduating class. And just to give you, and it was overtly, the vibe at least was definitely left wing, civil rights, all of that. In the class, let's see, ahead of me, included, out of the 30 in the class ahead of me, one was Angela Davis, And one was Mike Mirapole, who was the elder of the two Rosenberg kids, who had been adopted by the Mirapoles and was now going to EI. In my class, Janie Miller, who was Arthur Miller's daughter, was part of my class. There were just people like that.
When Bill refers to Mike Mirapole and the Rosenberg kids, he means the children of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were the atomic spies who were executed by the electric chair. Angela Davis became a political activist and an active member of the Communist Party of the USA and the Black Panther Party. She was imprisoned for a while and was feted in East Germany and the Soviet Union. After we recorded this interview, he also remembered that in the year above him was Kathy Bowden, who was an American radical leftist, served 23 years in prison for murder, and she was a founding member of the militant Weather Underground organization, who were bombing government buildings to express opposition to US foreign policy and racism.
And so the academics were very good. The political vibe was good. I would say it was not communist in the CPUSA sense. We were already getting to the time when it was going to came to be called the New Left in the U.S. The SDS, and the civil rights movement was just about to be jump into full play. So yeah, that was not a huge deal for me, I would say.
Did you have any contact with Angela Davis or Mike Mirapole?
Oh, sure. They were at lunch every day, any day. They were, there were only, between my class and their class, there were a total of 50 kids, 50, 60 kids. So yeah, we saw them all the time.
And after high school, you go to Harvard and you decide to do maths to emulate your favorite teacher. Now, is your favorite teacher that one that you told that 8/8 was in one?
You'd see. No, probably I was younger. I think that was just what in the U.S. we call our homeroom teacher, where she taught. She was one of my favorite teachers. She taught reading, writing, and math and stuff like that. I think they were wrong. He was my algebra teacher when I was a couple years later. But it was definitely the case that when I came back to the U.S. in high school and starting out in college, I didn't want to be a mathematician. I didn't want to solve the great mysteries of math. I wanted to be a high school math teacher, teaching algebra, because he had just he was just a good teacher, and so I wanted to do that. Those plans got got disrupted because even if you're just going to be a high school math teacher, you still have to take all the math courses, and they just got too hard. I could do third degree equations, but I couldn't do n degree equations. And so, but something else also intervened, and that is in the summer of 1964, depending on their age, some of your American listeners will recognize that date immediately. I joined many hundreds of white northern college kids and went down to Mississippi for the Mississippi Freedom Summer, where we registered voters and taught literacy to Black Mississippians, where the segregation and really the suppression of vote was really dramatic still in 1964. And it was during that period, again, like many of my age who were there, were the right age in 1964, came back. And by the way, there's again the connection with the starting in New Orleans and going to China and then coming back, sort of all of the knock-on effects of the McCarthy period and the Cold War and stuff. When people started coming around, recruiting people to go to Mississippi, which was a pretty big deal. It was pretty dangerous. And as many of your listeners know, 3 civil rights workers were killed in the first week, were arrested and then let out and beaten to death after they were released from prison. When they were recruiting, there was never even a moment's hesitation, either in me or my parents. Of course I'm going. Of course I'm going. It's the movement. That's what we do. We're communists. We're progressives. We do that. Of course I'm going to go. And so I went. And there were many who went for that reason. Many went who didn't have that kind of red diaper baby background, but did have a progressive-ish background, went. But of the many hundreds who went, a quite a good proportion then came back and went to law school to be movement lawyers or to work, in civil rights movement, doing the kind of stuff that we had learned in Mississippi. And that is indeed what I did. So and so I was still in college, so I said to hell with math, and I changed my major to political science or something like that, and got prepared to go to law school.
Right. When you're down in Mississippi, do you experience yourself some of the violence from the police forces and the other authorities down there?
Yeah, it was dramatic at the time, not quite as dramatic as some people say, but yeah, I was arrested, as many people were. Most of the work that we did, we were going around registering people to vote or canvassing for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And what we did is we did a parallel with the segregated regular Mississippi Democratic Party that was going to send its delegates to Atlantic City for the national convention, at which Lyndon Johnson was nominated. But our Democratic Party was open to blacks and whites. Not that many whites wanted to join, but we would go around the neighborhoods and we would say, "Do you want to sign this petition?" And we want to do. When the regular Democratic Party held its county convention, we would hold our county convention on the same day. And so we were going around with petitions, and we were also taking people to register to vote. And so I knocked on somebody's door, and a middle-aged white woman opened up, because in rural Mississippi, everything is segregated, but the housing is not often. And so, I said, okay, I don't discriminate against people. And I gave her the same pitch, and then so she later called the cops on me for, I think she said, riling up or disturbing the peace or whatever it was. So the cops came around, they threw me in, and I was wearing a little SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, little pin, and one of the cops, he banged me. He probably cracked one of my rings, sort of pushed me in the car with the thing, and he took the SNCC pin out of me and jabbed it into my thigh. It didn't really hurt much. It was kind of stupid, but he was, yeah. And so there, but I was in jail, sort of the equivalent of the drunk tank. There were 2 or 3 other people there, and it was pretty scary. And of course, everybody knew that I had been arrested, so they're quickly going out and bailing people out. But then I saw, I could see out of the window of the jail, the cop cars were peeling out, and they were putting shotguns up in the. I said, something's going on. It was pretty scary. But then the reason I laughed before was about, I was hurt a little bit, but it wasn't as big a deal. When they finally came to bail me out, um, the young woman who had all the papers, probably also a northern white college kid, just like me, about my age, she said, "Oh yeah, we heard you were brutally beaten by," and me, sort of the courageous me, said, "Well, I was beaten, but not brutally." And so, but yeah, no, it was definitely like the China years. That summer was a formative year, for my whole, you know, today, and much of it, again, going all the way back to, the full journey that I had come on. Later learned, and that's really what pushed me into the legal field as well is that other than literacy and helping to read the whole Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party efforts that I just described was designed by lawyers, by the guy actually who later became my law professor, was designed for the sole purpose of going to Atlantic City and saying to the convention, no, they don't represent Mississippi. We represent Mississippi because we are not segregated. They are. And so we demonstrated that they held full hearings um, on which delegation from Mississippi should be seated. They eventually offered a compromise, which was that our delegates, which included Fannie Lou Hamer, famous, when she was a young kid, she was a sharecropper. Now she's head of the Mississippi Freedom Democrat, were offered a sort of observer status. And so there was a big meeting in a little black church in Atlantic City, like 2 blocks from the boardwalk. And Atlantic City is like that too. It's checkerboard. It's a block of white houses, a block of black houses, a block of white houses, a block of white, and this little black church. And all of the top civil rights leaders and a lot of people who had been in Mississippi debated, should you accept this? Is half a loaf better than nothing? And eventually it was turned down, largely because no, we've been in the back of the bus before. Unacceptable. And one of the key moments when they were debating this, and this was all the head of the NAACP that I mentioned before was there, the head of CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, was there, all of the young students were there, all debating it out. Ultimately, this tiny little quiet white woman who was the widow of Mickey Schwerner, who had been murdered in Philadelphia, she came up and said no. And that was so powerful that, among other things, but I mean, that was just an incredible moment. And I later went to law school with her. She was the class ahead of me at the same law school, studying under the same law professor who was the mastermind behind the Atlantic City demonstrations and presentation. Basically, what we were doing, although all of us didn't know it, I was lucky enough that I was with a law student when I was we were gathering evidence. The whole summer, we were gathering evidence to take to Atlantic City.
And so I presume, like the founders of the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, were involved in these events as well. Did you know many of those people?
I knew some of them. They were spread all over the elite campuses. I knew the ones who were at Harvard. A lot of them were at Michigan, and a few other places. I was still in the Communist Party, and since going to Mississippi was sort of my what they called in the Communist Party, your mass work. You have your party work. We write articles and we prepare for the revolution. Didn't really mean very much, but then they join in the unions and they join in civil rights, and so I was doing this. SDS was again the beginning of a very, very different anti-communist New Left, or some might say not communist enough, that claiming that the CPUSA was just a bunch of old fogies who, even though I was in it, but they didn't know that probably, but that they a sort of a new way, and that was true in not only in the U.S. but in Europe, in everywhere. So yeah, I knew them as friends. I went to some of the meetings, some of the discussions. Yeah, but not super cool. And what wasn't definitely part of that movement, because we were all, just as it was starting, we were all getting close to graduation and moved on to other things as well.
So the summer of 65, you're working in the national office of the Communist Party USA. What are you doing there?
Well, it's funny to think of it now, because I mean now, and we probably don't have time to get to all that story, but now I'm a after law school and after then teaching law school for 20 years. I am now a very dedicated constitutional conservative, very anti-communist, very anti-Trump, very anti, this crazy populist new right, but the sort of the traditional constitutional, the Scalia type, middle of the road, and not middle of the road, but I mean, traditional liberal with a small L conservative. But in 1965, I was back from China, finished high school, been to Mississippi, but I'm still making making the communist revolution. And so I worked in the very small little office of the National Communist Party USA. And I worked on that. They had a journal called Political Affairs, which I think they still have. And I wrote an article for that about the New Left, as a matter of fact. But then one of the things that I was assigned to was not every day, but often I chauffeured a black communist guy called Henry Winston, who was blind. He had been one of the, I think it was 10, who had been imprisoned during, it was actually pre-McCarthy, I believe, under the Smith Act. And while he was in prison, he had some kind of a brain tumor or something or other, was not given sufficient appropriate medical care, and was blind. And so I drove him home and drove him, pick him up and take him into the Communist Party USA office from time to time. And of course, we would talk politics and making the revolution. And then it wasn't too long after that I'm now going to graduate from college and go on to law school. And I was very distinctly told or ordered or whatever you want to call it by the party to resign from the party because, and this again is a link back to the McCarthy periods of the Cold War. I mean, nowadays it would be the opposite. That gives you cachet if you were once a communist. But in those days, they did not want anybody be able to say, "Oh yeah, I mean, McCarthy was right," and there's now McCarthy's dead, but these commies are still trying to take over our law schools and stuff like that. So I nominally, formally left the party just before I went to law school, which was in fall of '66. But I was still very left wing, and as I said, I studied with this guy called Arthur Kanoy, who was really the brains behind much of the legal side of the civil rights movement, strategizing the Mississippi summer of '64 not only led to the demonstrations at Atlantic City, it was the evidence that led to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the single most significant civil rights act, in my opinion. That came to a great deal, to a great extent from thinking and scholarship by Arthur Kanoy. One of my other professors was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was just starting her career as one of the early feminists. I was in her first seminar. I was one of the first men who was, part of her form of her brand of feminism. Later, I actually clerked on the Supreme Court for her. So, there's so many circles are following up. And that's because after law school, I worked I went back, while talking about closing circles. My first year out of law school, I went back to New Orleans and I worked in the tiny little law firm of Ben Smith, the guy who had defended my father in the hearings at Tulane. And then after that,
Wow.
came back north, I worked on the Chicago 7 case that people have heard, the Abby Hoffman and all the movie, all of that. I worked in the city law department of the city of Newark, New Jersey, which had just elected its first black mayor. I worked in a project on the school law reform. And then I went to teach law school at Indiana University. I took a year off, taught at University of Chicago, taught for 20 years at Indiana University Law School in Indianapolis.
Wow. Wow. And what was your involvement with the Chicago 7 trial? What were you
Oh,
working on?
I first of all, I knew Bill Kunstler quite well because he was partners with my law professor, Arthur Kanoy. That nominally they had a firm called Kunstler and Kanoy. And so anything that Bill Kunstler was working on, Arthur knew about, and often he would get, if he was having a seminar, we would work on work on the briefs, work on things that Bill Kunstler was working on. Chicago 7 came up then. I worked on there's a famous case called the Jackson swimming pool case, where rather than Jackson, Mississippi, when they were ordered to integrate their public swimming pools, they just closed all the pools. And we tried to litigate that was just another form of segregation, because all the white kids would just go to private clubs and do their swimming there. But I also knew the Rutgers Newark community. We all, in addition to being close to Arthur Kanoy and therefore to Bill Kunstler, the other guy that's not, he's in the movie, if people have seen the movie, but was also very much involved in the trial, was a somewhat younger lawyer named Leonard Weinglass. And we all knew Lenny very well. His office was right across the street from the law school. He was a young, progressive, really bright guy. And so we were helping them write the briefs when it was up on appeal.
Wow. Wow. Incredible connections. Just so many strands here. Were you involved in the draft for the Vietnam War? Were you called up at all?
No, I was just by age and by luck, just as they were beginning to expand they were changing the age. At one point it was up to 26 or only up to 26, and then it was down and up and whatever. And before the lottery came in, I was just towards the end of the age where I would even be eligible to be drafted. I got one notice from my draft board, which was to appear for a physical. This was, I think I think I was already a lawyer. I had been to New Orleans and back. I was practicing law back in New Jersey, in the north. And I said, okay, report for your physical, which is step one, and then maybe you have to report, maybe you don't. And there were a whole bunch of us who were in this sort of progressive, left-leaning, but no longer communist coterie, who were part of what our work that we were doing is we were draft counseling. We were helping people who didn't want to go, to go through all of the steps that are required and say, no, 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 no. But first I want to, do this. And so I knew a lot about the draft laws. And one of the things that there was that in any step of the proceedings, you are entitled, if you want it, for the draft board or the draft people, selective service, to give you legal counsel to answer any questions. Now, I was a lawyer and I knew more than their people knew, but I said, well, I tell you what, I know that according to regulation so and so, I'm entitled to, this. I want you to appoint me that person. And then, but by the time, just between us, if you look at the calendar, by the time that person gets to talk to me, and then we go back and then you issue me a new order to report for physical, I'll already have passed my whatever birthday it was. And so you might as well just save your time and mine. And so they were sensible and said, okay, okay. And so I never even had to do the physical. Yeah, I was lucky. My brother who was quite a bit younger. He was born in 1950. He was in the draft lottery, but he got a number that was okay enough so that he never had to report to anything.
So in 1989, you get an invite back to China. Can you tell me about that? Because obviously 1989 is quite a pivotal year.
Oh yeah, I was in the by then I was a full-time law professor at Indiana University teaching constitutional law, legal ethics. And a year or so before that, our law school had started, as many law schools had, because this was before the crackdown. This was the sort of the flowering of during the Zhou period, the of beginnings of a thaw of Sino-U.S. relations. And so our law school had started a summer program in Shanghai where American students would go to China and study some facets of Chinese law. Some of the people there would meet with us, and we would do some comparing. How was their constitution different? And so, obviously, I was the obvious person. I was the first professor to represent our law school down at the Chinese law school. Year and a half later, it's now I've been teaching for quite some time. It was time for my 7 year sabbatical, and so I made an arrangement to go teach American law at a Chinese law school in Beijing for most of the year. Um, and then the plan was I would be in Beijing teaching at the Chinese law school. And my wife, by the way, was also a lawyer, also taught there. And then the plan was that after that semester was over, we would then, whole family and our young son, who was only then about 5 or 6, I think, would then go back to Shanghai and do the summer program again for American students coming over. Well, that was the spring of 1989, and demonstrations started happening. Tom died. There was the encampment that was long before June 4th. Schools started shutting down, and the demonstrations were massive, but they were very peaceful. It was sort of almost like teach-ins that we had had in the U.S. back in the 60s and 70s. Um, Believe it or not, during all that, Gorbachev came for a state visit right in the Hall of the People, right across from where there were 200,000 students just sitting in there in their encampment. I was able to, and of course, nobody was going to school anymore. They were all, demonstrating and putting up posters and making demands. Um, and my wife and I, and sometimes even our son Ivan, went to Tiananmen Square, talked to people. Some of our students who we knew we could talk to in English. My Chinese was still good enough so that I could talk sort of half and half with some of them. But I was able to, but in those early days, this was before May 27th, um, American journalists, CBS and ABC, were there, and I was able to go to. There was one, I can't remember which one it was, but one of the fairly famous U.S. reporters. I was able to point out to roving U.S. journalists and this massive group of people. Oh yeah, in that little circle there, those two guys or that gal, somebody, they speak English. They're university students. They're law students, so they can give you a pretty good interview. And I'm pretty sure at least a couple of them got on to U.S. TV in those early days. Then I moved down with my wife and son to Shanghai on May 27th, I think, was to start the summer program, because everything was actually, it was there was a lot of tumult, but everything was fine. And as a matter of fact, before we left, they declared martial law, but it was a very, look this up somewhere. It was a very friendly martial law. There was a bunch of people. They weren't armed, I'm pretty sure, but soldiers lining up, and the little old woman came out of the crowd and gave a cup of water because it was very hot. Gave water to the soldiers, to our uncle, so soldiers. Everything was fine, up until it wasn't fine. And so we started our classes in Shanghai. June 3rd happens, June 4th happens, and it was I was able to call Beijing, talk to people there. We decided that we would continue the classes in Shanghai because nothing, like that, and there was nothing we could do about anything except, watch the news. And so we continued for another couple of days, but then things got and parents back home in the U.S. and then finally the law school put pressure and said, no, we're canceling the program. But several of the U.S. students stayed on throughout the summer in Shanghai. But so that's how that trip ended. And then maybe just to cycle back and finish up with just one more last thing. It was only 2 years later that I was back in the U.S. and back at law school. I got an invitation from my old high school, not my students that I had been teaching, who were older, but people who were younger, rather, but people who were my age, who I had gone to junior high with. I got an invite because it was the 90th anniversary of the school. So it wasn't a reunion. It was like a 90th reunion for the whole school. And so I said, yeah, I'll go back. And so it was sort of over a weekend. I flew out to Beijing, went to the school. All the kids were there. We sang some old Young Pioneer songs in Chinese, and the young kids were like, oh, here's this Chinese who still could sing and speak in Chinese, And then we went out. The people in my class, not the current students there. We went out to the famous Peking duck restaurant, Quanjude, to have a little dinner. And we were talking, and they're bringing, the wine, and the duck comes up in the little elevators that it comes up in. And they're all talking to each other. Many of them hadn't seen each other for a long time because they were their old high school buddies, and now they're, into almost middle age. And they're saying all sorts of things that got me kind of nervous, like they're not quite, they're not, and they're not anti-government in the sense of, we're going to make revolution, or it's 1949 all over again or whatever, but it was definitely critical. And they were all speaking in Chinese to each other. And I'm sitting at one of the other tables, and one of my friends from when we were, young kids there, he saw that I was, worried, that I looked, I said, well, man, isn't anybody going to get arrested? Or, is that safe to say that? And I think he addressed me in English, or he said, but anyway, when my friend said, well, yeah, wow, it's June 6th was only a year and a half ago, or what is that? Okay. And he said something really interesting that I absolutely, will not forget, which is, he said, oh yeah, he said, nowadays in China, you can say anything you want. You just can't do anything. And I thought that was a pretty good coda on, where all of that comes from. Yeah.
The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.